This isn't just another story about a factory line slowing down or a quarterly earnings dip. This is about a billion-dollar wedge driven straight through the heart of Detroit and through the livelihoods of thousands of workers from Michigan to Ontario. It's about tariffs, politics, and the future of American cars colliding head-on. It all started when the White House announced sweeping new auto tariffs. On April 2025, President Trump imposed a 25% duty on all imported vehicles and automotive components. What was billed as a precision tool to bring jobs back to America quickly turned into a wrecking ball smashing through global supply chains. By May 1st, GM itself admitted the obvious. These tariffs would slice as much as $5 billion off its 2025 earnings. In a shareholder letter, CEO Mary Barra warned investors that the blow would drain research funds, squeeze margins, and force difficult decisions. Wall Street heard it loud and clear, trimming forecasts and sending tremors across the auto sector. The company had already been under pressure. For years, GM relied on a complex supply web, with up to 40% of components in some models imported from abroad. Silverado, Equinox, Escalade. These aren't just American icons. They're global assembly puzzles. A steering knuckle from Mexico, electronics from Korea, wiring looms from Brazil, batteries from China. Once the tariffs hit, every part carried a surcharge. Add that to existing steel and aluminum tariffs, and the average GM truck suddenly carried an extra $3,000 on its back. Inside GM's finance team, alarms blared. Managers calculated that nearly every model would take a direct hit. The Silverado, America's workhorse, became significantly more expensive to build overnight. And Wall Street investors, unwilling to stomach shrinking margins, began demanding price increases to protect shareholder returns. Consumers braced themselves for sticker shock on dealership lots. The White House offered a small concession. A complicated rebate structure, capped between 3.75% and 2.5%, was introduced for vehicles assembled on U.S. soil with North American parts. But for a company whose supply chains cross borders multiple times for a single component, the relief was a drop in the bucket. GM calculated that the offsets couldn't possibly cover the gap. The billion-dollar wedge remained firmly lodged in its balance sheet. What happens when automakers are forced into this corner? The risks pile up fast. Analysts warned that production slowdowns were inevitable, and rumors spread across shop floors about temporary layoffs. Workers whispered about elastic idling, where plants pause for weeks or months, not as a permanent closure, but as a costly waiting game until parts and demand stabilize. Some predicted tens of thousands of jobs could be vulnerable if the tariffs stayed in place through year's end. Whether that meant idled shifts, delayed product launches, or frozen hiring, the effect on working families was undeniable. Mortgage bills don't wait for tariff relief. Neither do grocery receipts. The pain wasn't confined to GM. Suppliers felt it first. A single part like a steering knuckle, once $28, jumped to $36 after tariffs. Multiply that by 30,000 unique parts in a vehicle, and you begin to see the ripple. Seat manufacturers, wiring harness suppliers, electronics producers all reported rising costs. The margins of smaller suppliers, already razor-thin, buckled under the weight. Analysts warned that if tariffs persisted, bankruptcies in the supplier base could spread like dominoes, creating holes in the supply chain that couldn't easily be patched. Wall Street punished GM quickly. After the May shareholder letter, forecasts were slashed, and GM's stock outlook dropped by double digits. Some banks suggested that if the tariffs stretched into 2026, GM's debt could be downgraded, raising its borrowing costs just when it needed capital most. But beyond spreadsheets and balance sheets, the real drama unfolded in the world GM has staked its future on: electric vehicles. For 2 years, GM was hailed as America's tip of the spear in the EV revolution. The Ultium battery platform, touted as the backbone of a new era, was supposed to power everything from Silverados to Cadillacs. Billions had been poured into retooling plants like Factory Zero in Detroit to mass-produce electric pickups. GM's promise to investors and policymakers was clear. It would deliver hundreds of thousands of EVs by mid-decade. Then, 3 dominoes fell. First, the $7,500 federal EV tax credit disappeared after a policy reversal in Washington. Second, Congress froze funding for a nationwide charging network, leaving thousands of promised charging stations on the drawing board. Third, the very minerals needed for batteries, lithium, nickel, cobalt, were slapped with tariffs of their own. raising the cost of Ultium cells at the worst possible time. Suddenly, GM's EV strategy looked like it was hitting a brick wall. Consumers balked at higher sticker prices, skeptical of whether they'd find a charger on a long drive. Insurance premiums for EVs rose sharply, as did electricity rates in many regions. GM's internal forecasts suggested EV demand could fall far short of the 100,000 unit annual sales threshold needed just to break even on Ultium trucks. If only 65,000 sold in 2025, the math became painful. Each unsold EV tied up $45,000 of capital. Batteries risked degrading in storage, and lots filled with unsold electric pickups wrapped in plastic. The image of an EV dream gathering dust became a symbol of how quickly optimism can sour. Some analysts asked, was the EV dream overestimated, or was it simply tariff-choked? The truth may lie somewhere in between. Consumers weren't rejecting EVs outright, but the removal of incentives combined with higher input costs created a perfect storm. Without relief, GM's ambitious timelines for EV adoption looked increasingly unrealistic. The tariff war also exposed divisions on the shop floor. Workers in Detroit and Ontario, once fiercely loyal to their badges and unions, began to argue over the politics of tariffs. In the U.S., UAW President Shawn Fain praised the tariffs as finally putting American jobs first. In Canada, Unifor condemned GM for trading away Canadian livelihoods for political points south of the border. Among rank-and-file workers, some who once cheered tariffs began to mutter, "Cut the damn tariffs." Mortgage payments blurred the ideological lines. Over time, disappeared. Toolboxes sat by the door, ready for another idling notice. The political theater made matters worse. Trump, unmoved by GM's complaints, shrugged and said the company made its choices. No bailout, no quick fix, just a reminder to adapt or sink. Workers and unions, caught between nationalism and survival, struggled to find common ground. The longer the standoff dragged on, the more divided they became. And divided workers, as history shows, rarely unite to force real change. The ripples stretched beyond GM Stellantis' Windsor plant in Canada, the last minivan plant in North America, braced for roller coaster schedules and potential layoffs if Chinese parts remained tariffed. Volvo Trucks' U.S. operations faced steep price increases on rigs, threatening sales to fleet buyers. GM Korea, exporting most of its output to the U.S., feared the tariffs could push it toward the same fate as GM's abandoned Australian unit years earlier. Hyundai and Kia rushed to expand capacity in Alabama and Georgia, but those new jobs wouldn't arrive until 2027. Supply chains spanning Mexico to Canada saw chaos at the border, where a single customs error could cost suppliers millions. In the boardrooms of Detroit, planners sketched three possible futures. In the best case, alternative supply chains from Brazil or Mexico restored parts flows by summer. Production recovered slowly, and GM hit its modest 65,000 EV sales target for 2025. In the middle case, further tariffs on Japanese and Korean electronics sent infotainment costs soaring, while Washington gridlock left no relief in sight. Debt whispers grew louder. In the worst case, China retaliated by cutting rare earth exports, stalling Ultium production altogether. Plants went dark, and the dream of American EV leadership crumbled before it truly began. GM has already announced a $4 billion investment to shift some production from Mexico to the U.S., reconfiguring plants and preparing to add more North American jobs. That move, framed as both patriotic and pragmatic, signaled GM's recognition that supply chains must be rebuilt closer to home. But even that multi-billion-dollar bet cannot erase a $5 billion tariff gap. And so, the verdict remains uncertain. Were tariffs a strategic gamble to bring jobs back, or a self-inflicted stall that threatens to idle plants and hollow out communities? The answer depends on what happens next. If policymakers adjust, if supply chains reroute, and if consumer demand stabilizes, the lines can roar back to life. But if tariffs tighten, credit dries up, and incentives remain frozen, the silence on those factory floors could last for years. This is the crossroads facing GM, its workers, and the entire auto industry. Tariffs, sold as a shortcut to American prosperity, now risk becoming the pothole that swallows it whole. The question is no longer just about cars. It's about national strategy, industrial resilience, and whether America's auto future will be written by innovation or by politics. So, now it's over to you. Are these tariffs truly helping American jobs, or are they quietly strangling them? Will GM's electric dreams survive the weight of higher costs and lower demand? Or has America driven itself into a cul-de-sac of its own making? These aren't just boardroom questions. They're questions that will decide paychecks, mortgages, and the direction of an industry that has defined the American century. And that's why we'll keep watching. Because when the dust clears, one thing is certain: the auto industry will never be the same again. Stay tuned, because this ride is far from over.